Okay, good morning, Dad. Today is
Good
Wednesday,
morning.
October 9th, and I want to start this episode off by giving you kind of a large amorphous question, and we'll see how you handle it, take it. So,
Okay.
I want to just ask you, what in your mind are the biggest threats or problems facing America right now? Because we're often just laser focused in on the conflict in the Middle East and also in Ukraine, but then if you look around at home, we have people will bring up things like freedom of speech is a real threat. We have essentially a defunct political system. The economy doesn't seem to be doing that well. We have crumbling infrastructure. We
Right.
got, the hurricanes rolling through. Milton is apparently getting ready to just tear up Florida right now. It seems quite scary. So there's a lot going on. And maybe you can kind of just break it down and we doesn't that if you think that the conflicts that we're talking about are definitely the most important, you can make that case and tell us why, but you can maybe also talk about some of these other issues that are going on in the U.S. And in a way, I think they all kind of maybe tie together in some ways, but
Uh-huh.
and see if you can offer solutions as well.
I don't know about the last part. I don't know if I have any
No
solutions.
solutions,
I would
okay.
say, well, I'll start with the one which I think is truly is the worst, but it's also the one without a solution, without an obvious political solution. And it's, I would say, cultural or moral degradation that our country is really sliding into an abyss, and families into a moral abyss. Our families are breaking down, and it's a true horror. But at the same time, it's not the sort of thing that you can solve by voting for one party or the other. I really don't think you can. This is something that's going to have to. I think maybe it's true of some of the other problems, but I think it's particularly true when we're talking about morality or culture, that it's got to be forged, at the grassroots. The solution has to be forged at the grassroots level, through families, through communities, and it's going to take time, and it's going to probably only work its way out, through the course of several different crises. Um, I think in the current time you see, I would say an awakening. Let's see, on the edges, there's more and more people are becoming alarmed at what's happening to the country, and so you find individual churches, individual communities, but they're relatively powerless. Maybe they're seeds of a future. Um, of a new America somewhere, decades in the future. But that's the thing. I truly think that's the worst thing. But I don't even talk about it because there's not much you can do.
Well,
Um,
can you maybe just provide some evidence or proof of this cultural and moral degradation? I think a lot of people agree with you, but other people may just say that's just an opinion. Like, well, how do we
uh-huh,
know that we are truly
right,
sliding into some type of moral
right. Well,
abyss,
yeah,
immoral abyss, I should
I,
say.
I would, I think a good, something that kind of um, has opened the eyes of many to the fact is just the transgender craziness. The Who was it? Matt Walsh recently came, up with that video, "What is a Woman?"
Mm.
And he interviewed all kinds of academics and um, pundits, and and these people couldn't answer the question. It just seems to me that in a society where you can't answer that question, that's a society that's in real trouble. I mean, I think uh, that just brings it all to the surface and just it shows the depth of our confusion and depravity, and then other manifestations of it, where you get big hairy men competing in high school sports, or uh, your mother works at a clothing store, and occasionally these big hairy men come in with purses, and they demand to be treated as women. And it's just like in years past, you would just think, like, poor guy, he's kind of nutty. Maybe they'll take him back to the loony bin when this is, when he leaves the store or something. But now everybody has to bow down and pretend that this craziness is somehow healthy and normal, and needs more than that, needs to be celebrated. And that if you question it, then you're obviously an evil person. This is, it's just insane. I think most of the country sees it as insane, but there is a very powerful segment of the country that insists that this is what has to be, that it's almost a sacred cause. I mean, the establishment does. That's where we are.
Yeah. Well, people are afraid. They're afraid of being labeled transphobic, and most people are nice. People want to be friendly and treat everybody kindly.
Right.
So I think there's that fear, and they just don't want to be labeled as somehow a bigot. But yeah, it's true. It's kind of crazy. I feel like I could make a lot of money on transgender sports betting, though, if that ever happens in the future. But we'll see. So there's no solution to this.
Yeah, I don't. Well, I mean, there's a solution, but it's not something that's easily divide. It's not going to come through voting for that party or this party. It's it'll have to be overcome. But I don't see it happening in the present circumstances. It's going to, like I say, there's going to have to be crises. It's going to happen. It's going to happen, I believe, at the grassroots level, unless there's some sort of party, which probably would be kind of scary, um, that might actually affect a solution at the current time. I don't see it.
Have there been any historical precedents for things like this, where a society or a country decays morally, and it causes things to break apart? I mean,
Well, a
was
lot of
Rome
people
like
actually,
that? I mean,
well, interestingly, a lot of people pointed to the Weimar Republic prior to the rise of the Nazis. I'm not making any prediction here, but um, there were some similar kind of phenomena. These were unheard of things, but you did have transgenders and kind of a celebration of sexual perversion that took place in the Weimar Republic during the 20s. Um, and that's something that actually the Nazis attacked and gave them strength because in general, a lot of people were sickened by it. Now it turned out, of course, they had a lot more on their agenda than stamping out transgenders. But I think that's one example. I think again, it's very minor compared to what we're seeing now. There wasn't anything like that taking place in schools. Or, people weren't reporting their pronouns or whatever. It's gone a lot farther, but there was kind of an incipient woke revolution, you could say, in the Weimar Republic. It was just the beginnings of the kind of phenomena that we see now.
hmm. Is this woke revolution that we've experienced, is it contained only to the West, to the Western world, to Western Europe and, Canada,
Yeah,
US?
basically, to the West, you could say, like the West and the Anglosphere and its close allies. So there you have to include a few Asian countries like Taiwan and South Korea, and maybe Japan hasn't really gone along with it entirely, but there are pressures for Japan too as well. Um,
And so it seems like close allies, Japan and South Korea, these are, ancient, very homogeneous, strong societies,
right.
culturally. So, if I've been to both Japan and South Korea, they are distinct, and you go there, they're all Japanese there, and they're all South Korean in South Korea.
Yeah.
And so the fact that they have adopted some of this, is it
Right. Yeah, I
purely
don't know
as a
really. I
result
don't know the
of,
extent to which Japan has, but definitely Taiwan has,
okay,
and that's in
Taiwan.
great contrast to mainland China.
Is that just a direct result of something that the United States and the West is pushing on other countries that
I
say you
think
want to
and
become part of our?
yeah. Well, it's also it's geopolitical. Both of them are very much client states of the U.S. and NATO, and they see themselves as very tightly aligned um, with the U.S. and the U.S. is their protectors, vis-a-vis China or North Korea. Um, but it's part of it is this. Well, the fact of this relationship has meant that over the course of decades, you've had many that the elite of places like Taiwan, and I don't know South Korea as well, but I know it's true in Taiwan. The elite has almost entirely been educated in the U.S., and if not in the U.S., in Western European universities. So that education includes, they of course have learned technical skills, but also they get indoctrinated. They're taught the latest ideology, and so they come back with it, and in their minds, they associate being advanced with these ideas. That's what they're taught in the U.S. schools. Again, they come back with the latest knowledge, and part of the latest knowledge is being woke, and so that gets imposed upon, their respective countries or territories, I guess we should say.
So, how did this problem even arise? Is it purely just through the universities? Because it seems like it exploded all of a sudden. You know what? I mean, I'm not that old,
Yeah.
but
Well, it's
when I
been
was in
cooking.
high
I mean, there's
school,
been right
it wasn't
there.
a thing.
Well, I mean, it it was a thing, it did. I think it is fair to say that it did start within these universities, and so you found, some of these really far out ideas, what we would call woke ideology, in universities, maybe 20 years in advance. At first, and people would make fun of them. They would, the conservative media would, write satires, but it was kind of funny back then. It seemed like, it was just a sort of a weird, limited hothouse phenomenon. And you could kind of, it's like, pointing at certain creatures in the zoo. But what they weren't thinking is that these academic institutions educated future leaders, just as they did for, Taiwan and South Korea, they did for our own country. And so you end up having an elite. It's not just the politicians, but the lawyers and the leading law firms, and the staff and leading media organizations, media outlets. Now it's hard to explain the why of it. It's a mysterious phenomenon, but I think that's the conveyor belt.
Yeah, well, then the conveyor belt needs to be reconstructed, dismantled, fixed, right? So
Uh-huh.
if we're going to solve these problems, there needs to be a real change in the university system, right? In our education system. Do you think that's possible? I mean, you said
Well,
grassroots, but it seems like
yeah,
people
right.
had strong communities took care of them, and then they send their
Yeah.
kids off to university, and then
Right,
they
right.
come
No, no, no,
back and they
yes,
serve.
right. Yeah, I guess when I say a crisis, it's just that, that actually these universities are, I think these universities have to fall down and be rebuilt from the beginning. Right now, it's just that they're so totally under the control of these forces, that I just don't see any sort of reform taking place within them. I think they're incapable of self-reform, and that
Mm,
essentially it has to fall down. And I don't know how that's going to happen. That's why I say I don't have an answer to this. I started off with, I think this is the worst, but I really don't see how it's going to be solved. I trust one, it can't last forever because it's so crazy. In the end, it's self-destructive, and it's
right.
helping to bring apart bring about the destruction of our country. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's already pushback and division over this, and I think institutions like these universities are suffering as a result of it. I think fewer men, especially, are attending university,
yeah,
and really just the cost of university. You just realize that you do a cost benefit analysis. Like, is this really worth it? And when I look back at, I had a great time in college. I loved it, but I don't
yeah, I
think
know
I've
you
learned
did.
that much. I didn't learn that much, to be honest. I don't think.
Made a lot of friends. So.
Yeah, but okay, so that's a big problem. No
Yeah,
real solution. There going to be some collapse within the institutions, grassroots changes. We got to focus on doing a good job. Don't abdicate the responsibility of raising your children
right.
to the school system completely.
Yeah,
Obviously, be involved in your children's life. Go
yeah,
to a church or whatever, and to kind of bring back some of that moral fiber back into your kids. Because if you just leave them, drop them off
right.
at the school and then the university, they're not being fed the right stuff, and
Uh-huh.
then you have the generational long problems.
Right,
That's the issue. Is that it's hard to rewire
right.
a
Yeah,
human being.
right. Well, I guess there's one cause for hope that I've heard, is that, yeah, I mean, a lot of young people are being indoctrinated, but I think more than ever before, you have skeptics and people and young people, I think especially young men at this point, that are just resistant to it, who are see what's going on. So the indoctrination has gotten worse, but the resistance has also grown. So there's an increasing polarization. I mean, again, I think the majority of people, just young people, get indoctrinated and believe in it. But there is a substantial minority that, from what I understand, and I've seen some of this with my own eyes, um, a substantial minority that completely rejects the indoctrination, the woke
Mm.
indoctrination.
So yeah, we use this term culture war. Do you think culture war can break into an actual war? Like that this
Well,
divide will
yeah.
get so.
Who knows? I mean, we use it less. Essentially, like I remember hearing the term culture war back, for example, in the early '90s. And Pat Buchanan gave a famous kind of culture war speech at the Republican convention. I believe it was in 1992. And but now you don't hear it so much. And I say essentially it's because um, the radicals won. They overtook all the institutions. Um, so but like I was saying, it's like out there in the heartland, out those young men that haven't gone to college and whatever. And there's this sort of a growing. It's not fair to say an army, because they don't have. Well, they're not armed and they're not organized, but there are, a lot of young people, especially young men, that are very that maybe eventually they're material for a future army. But again, this is something I think I don't see it any happening anytime in the near future.
Mm. Okay. Well, what about other issues that are really pressing that are crippling the United States? So we have
Yeah,
sort of the moral fiber integrity of the United States has just been
yeah.
degraded, and that will cause all kinds of issues down the road. But we have how are things like the economy, or if you want to speak about freedom of speech, like how dangerous is this, and how big of a threat is it to the United States?
Yeah. Well, obviously, yeah, there is an attack on freedom of speech. We see it in the close cooperation between major, social networking media platforms and the U.S. government. As Matt Taibbi has done, I think, the best work on that, and he continues to come up with more and more evidence of this, very close coordination. It's clear that the U.S. government has been trying to censor speech, and they have, in fact, not just tried, they have, censored speech. The most famous example of which was the Hunter Biden laptop that may have affected, the outcome of the election in 2020.
Hmm.
That was just a clear, deliberate suppression based on, a false claim, a claim that the Russians were behind it, and of course they weren't. Um, but yeah, speech clearly is suppressed, is censored. Um, Facebook and, for example, is famous, is particularly bad. I think about that. Uh,
Hmm.
but but even Twitter X, that's supposed to be the free speech platform. It does censor speech, but it's freer. There's no question that it's freer than it used to be. When Elon Musk took over, there were dissidents that had been driven from the platform, and they did come back. I saw it happen, and
Hmm.
they're still on the platform. But then there clearly is suppression of a certain amount of shadow banning and so on and so forth for, advocates for the Palestinians,
Is
because
that,
again,
do you think that has to do in coordination with the US government, or is that something that maybe Elon Musk is even putting his finger on?
yeah,
Because,
maybe because he is an avid, Zionist. And that's,
right.
yeah. So that may be, it is freer. We have to be honest about that. It is freer. There was, YouTube. It has banned certain channels, and clearly for political reasons, geopolitical reasons. And thinking about Scott Ritter or Dimitri Simes, for example. And then there were a number of other, let's say, channels critical of American Western hegemony that were banned recently. but they just came back. It looked like they were gone. Or thinking about the Rachel Levin's show, DD Geopolitics, Glenn Deason, which was one of the most amazing because, again, he's just such a soft-spoken, reasonable political scientist, from Norway. But all those channels were resurrected. And apparently what happened was that Jeffrey Sachs intervened. Jeffrey Sachs, who himself is very much, a very harsh critic of Western hegemony, but he interviewed, but he's still, obviously um, has some influence. But he intervened, and I think especially on behalf of Glenn Deason, and that led to the other channels being resurrected. So, but it shows they were returned, but with a warning. And there was this absurd. They had been initially shut down on the basis, on the basis of the claim that they had violated hate speech laws. And, if you follow any of these channels, as I have, that's just absurd, just absolutely absurd. They're just but that's what it was said. Numerous and repeated, violations of our hate speech laws and shut down. Now they brought them back, but then, they said, be careful. So they're put on notice. So there is, so there is clearly there's a certain amount of censorship. There has been rather severe censorship. It seems to be very specific, like it was during COVID, there was a lot of censorship, directed. You were not allowed to be skeptical about the vaccines. And then it was later admitted that, a lot of the skepticism was science-based, but it was suppressed. It was just channels were eliminated, and there was very severe censorship over that. And then there's also very severe censorship over the, questioning of the legitimacy of the election. Of course, you can't question the legitimacy of the 22, but you were free to question the legitimacy of 2016. That's how it goes. So it's kind of hit or miss on YouTube and in some of these other platforms. And I think by and large, well, there clearly has been an effort. There's no question. Again, Matt Taibbi's shown this very, very clearly, and he continues to dig up the information showing it. There has been an effort to censor, and there has been a lot of real censorship. But it's in specific cases like the election and the vaccine, it's been very extensive. But by and large, I think it's failed, and that's just that because we have the media environment that we do. There are so many of these social these different platforms that people know how to access, that it's just very, very difficult for the government to shut things down. So it may be, there's reason to be worried. First of all, it's just very worrying that we have a government that sees the need to do this and is trying to do it. And you get people like Hillary Clinton and John Kerry just saying openly that we should put this at the top of our agenda. We need to, stop disinformation. And by disinformation, they mean information that's critical of the establishment. So that we have this. I don't know if they're really going to succeed. It seems to me the main problem is not the internet. This is what they're very upset that they can't control the internet. Well, good. And maybe they won't be able to control the internet. But the real censorship, where it's effective, and where the establishment narrative, is unchallenged is in the legacy media. So, if you're watching Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, as, the older generation does, and not just the older generation, but just a lot of the establishment does, that's they are not being exposed to any dissident ideas.
Yeah, well, there's such a need for the government to censor and to just toss the First Amendment in the trash can because we've tethered ourselves to these blatantly false narratives.
Yeah.
COVID, we won't go into too much, but clearly, you have very respectable doctors and scientists saying things and they're being canceled. Like, you shouldn't have to do that if you're on the right, if you're telling the truth about things. But then it's the same thing we're seeing here with Ukraine and in Israel. It's if you try to tell what's actually happening on the ground, it doesn't fit their narrative. So they have to control it. And it seems like this is all important to them to keep these globalist projects going to keep this narrative going. So I
Right.
feel like as things progress, there will be more and more urgency for them to censor even more, but then it just kind of backfires on them more. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure how do you see it going in the future as these conflicts play out, and because you talked about these shows like the Rachel Blevin show, Glenn Decent, they talk about what we talk about, right?
Hmm.
So and they got censored because do you think that they're going to be doubling down on it, and that type of speech will be
Well,
even?
there's obviously the risk. It happened once. This time they got a reprieve. Maybe next time they might not. That's what we'll see. And I have to say, it does hurt the cause. It does hurt the dissident cause, because a lot of people find channels like that and follow them through YouTube. And I've seen certain channels, be shut down on YouTube, and then I'll get a message. Okay, we're up on Rumble, and I go over to Rumble, and they're not getting even a tenth of the viewership over there that they would get on YouTube.
Right.
Now, maybe at some point that there's a risk that if they shut down too many channels, and all these channels start to migrate to Rumble, then you'll have a major shift in viewership over there. I think it's just when there are a few outliers, you can get rid of the outliers, and most people are too lazy to do anything about it, and they just watch something else. Um, but and then there's a risk, because we've seen this happen before. If too many dissident channels do go to Rumble, let's say there really is a major crackdown on channels critical of Western hegemony, and then they all migrate to we'll just say Rumble. Then there are ways to go after Rumble. That's what we've seen. We see what's happening. That Telegram is also another alternative platform, and you see how that's under attack. We'll see if Durov is able to withstand the pressure to hand over the keys to Western intelligence. We'll see what happens. I guess all in all, though, it's worrisome, and it shows that again that I think, just as you're saying, I think like you're pointing out, it shows the weakness really of the establishment. And I will contrast it again, as I've done in the past, to the Western establishment that I remembered as a child. There were alternative. The Soviet Union had Pravda and TASS, but nobody was worried about that, like winning over the hearts and minds of Americans, because it was silly. They generally had to lie. Now, it turns out they didn't always lie. Sometimes we lied. It wasn't absolutely black and white. But by and large, we had a free press, and you could get the truth in the West, and the Soviet Union controlled its information and hid a lot of facts and distorted reality. I think by and large, it's fair to say that was true, and people in the West who had free access to information could see it, and so there wasn't any fear on the part of the establishment. Oh my God, we can't let these people, read Pravda or listen to Soviet radio or something. They might get the wrong ideas, because nobody, we were confident in what we had, and it was just everybody was trying to, people were trying to defect to our country. There was climbing the Berlin Wall to get to freedom and so forth. That was the world that we lived in, but we don't live in that world anymore. And now it's not, as you say, it's just that we have an establishment that has really committed itself to a false version of events, a false reality. And I would say, it's across a broad spectrum. It would start with like the woke stuff, which is, again, very unpopular through the world. But just, the geopolitical is clearly it's a false narrative that we're pushing. Whether we're talking about Palestine or we're talking about Ukraine or a number of issues, it's a false narrative. And, like RT doesn't have to be extremely clever, to come up with some sort of, to persuade people that this that the Western narrative is false. They just need to actually report the facts. It's
Right.
very, very easy when you're on the side of the truth. And
Right.
and it's really scary if you're, on the side of law. So that's why, you're just desperate to shut things down.
Right. In the marketplace of ideas, we lose. So
Yeah,
we have to alter the marketplace. We have to remove certain players from this marketplace of ideas and just
right.
only allow ours to crowd out any of the dissident voices. Um, so is there any solution to this? How can we combat this? I mean, I guess things that like what we're doing, we're just,
Yeah. Well,
a
that's
couple.
right, exactly. Just to support, as an individual, certainly support dissident media. It's important. And we're very small players, and there are many other players. We each have our own role, our own particular angle, but we all are critical of Western hegemony and picking away at the at the false narrative that's been put out there. So yes, support dissident media, and then there is some hope. The argument for a free press and the First Amendment is not dead in the U.S. It still resonates strongly. You have these establishment figures that are actually speaking out directly against it, but that does raise a lot of eyebrows. Now, I've heard. I mean, it's kind of worrying because what you find, like these recent polls have shown, that the younger generation and also racial minorities, who are a growing proportion of the population, tend to not have that devotion to the First Amendment that previous generations had. There's a weakening within the population too. So that is quite worrying. So, but still at this point, the First Amendment argument gets a lot of support. And it's amazing that you do have people like Kerry and Clinton that just kind of openly speak against it. It just shows
Right.
how far they've gone from their roots.
Right. I just feel like anybody that makes the argument that we need to get rid of the First Amendment, like who's going to think that's okay?
Yeah.
Like you're
Well,
on the side of censorship, but clearly there are. There
yeah,
clearly are.
no,
They do
within
have
the
the supporters.
establishment, and then just there's this younger generation, just hasn't been, I guess it's maybe a result of corrupted education.
Okay. Well, let's keep this doom and gloom train going a little bit longer.
Okay, well, we can talk about the economy or
Yeah,
something.
well,
Right?
exactly. How's the
Right.
economy doing? Yeah.
By the way, I mean, that's like the last one is something that can be addressed to some extent by, legislation and to protect rights and by choosing the right kind of judges. So that's something that does have, at least in the short run, and I would say in the medium term, a political solution, and where I think, voting can make a difference. The cultural
Okay.
thing is just not easy to fix. It's that way. It's impossible, in my opinion, at least at the present time.
All right. Fix
Now,
the economy for us, Dad. How
yeah,
do we
okay,
fix
fix the
this?
economy. Well, yeah, we have just this out of control debt. I think right now we're just about the debt is. It's measured in different ways, but basically we're reaching the highest point that we've had in our history. The previous high was 1946, and for obvious reasons. It was the end of World War II, and then so the government borrowed a lot to support the war effort, and then we just drew down the debt from there and pretty much eliminated it. By the time the 60s rolled around. But we just don't have the excuse for it right now. It's just there's nothing. We have gone very deeply into debt, and we're seeing the consequences already. It's just like what is $1 trillion $1 trillion in interest payments
Yeah, you're right.
for every year now, or is it every?
Well, I've heard different numbers. I mean, we're adding what supposedly $1 trillion of debt every 100 days, but the interest payment I think was supposed to be about $1 trillion every year.
Right. Okay.
We're about that now. Maybe it's supposed to be next year. That's to be about $1 trillion, and I believe we're adding about. I mean, you can break down the numbers, but I think
Yeah.
it's
Right.
$35 billion a day in debt. So
Yeah.
obviously, we have a huge debt problem,
Right.
and
A
with the
huge.
higher interest rates, the debt rolling over is the that creating that avalanche. The
Right.
rollover debt at the low interest rates are now being rolled over to the high interest rate debt. So
Yeah. Right. Now this is, we've gone away with it. Most countries would be in some sort of crisis right now. Just the fact that we have the world reserve currency has allowed us to avoid crisis so far. But there is obviously a limit, and it's what happens. It's just that historically the dollar um, uh, has meant safety to major investors, around the world, including governments. And then when a crisis hits, an economic crisis or a war, or whatever, they tend to park their money in U.S. dollars, even when they're getting very little in return. It's just that the assumption is that no matter what, it's safe here. And but you're seeing that's starting to soften. There's been a movement away from the dollar, and we've talked about that. It's partly because of the weaponization of the dollar. I think that's clearly true. But then I think it's just that the fundamentals are looking bad. It's just the high rate of debt. It starts to ring some alarm bells. It's not a full out four alarm fire. People aren't panicking, but investors it's raising eyebrows, so you just don't see the same kind of movement to the dollar that you saw before, and that's the real danger is at some point we'll hit a tipping point. Inevitably there is. It's just nobody knows exactly where that tipping point is, where those concerns reach a point that cause a significant move from the dollar. And when that significant move out from the dollar takes place, then it begins to accelerate because everybody sees it and says, oh, my God, it's like a run on a bank, It's just like everything's fine until it isn't.
but
And
my question,
that's a risk that we're running. And, who knows the day when it happens, but it's approaching. It's just that we're much closer to it now than we were, let's say, even 10 years ago.
right? My question is, why hasn't it happened already?
Yeah.
Because the initial, let's say, the bank run, when all these countries that are holding dollars in reserves, why hasn't there been why haven't we seen more governments begin to unload these dollars at a more rapid pace? Because I've listened to lots of different economists and financial experts, and it's a consensus, and everybody knows it around the board. I mean, even here in the United States, we know that we're in decline, that we're in trouble, and it's been exposed even more so after what we've done in Ukraine. That we don't have the military might and the economic might, the ability to sanction. The weaponizing the dollar, putting all these sanctions on Russia was supposed to kill it. It didn't, and we stole all of Russia's money. I forget how much, $300 billion of frozen Russian assets we just stole. China, and there's all this rhetoric geared towards China on how we got to focus our attention against China. We have this bubbling in the Middle East. All these other countries are realizing like, whoa, if they're able to just steal Russia's money, then why China's like, we'll just steal ours, right? So I don't understand. Everybody kind of knows the way the world's going, that we are moving towards a multipolar world, and that the dollar is losing credibility. It has been weaponized. It's no longer the safe haven. Then why isn't there already been this run on the U.S. bank as the reserve currency? Why the smart move would be to start converting your currencies. And I know that they're doing that. China's been doing that. Brazil's been doing that. Russia's been doing it for a long time and leading up to this as well, buying more and more gold and drawing down the dollar savings. But wouldn't the smart move to be, if you're a country like China, just be, let's dump it and move it all into the asset, and then we crash the dollar. I guess it hurts their economy too because of the export business.
Right.
Anyways, I'm rambling. I'm rambling.
Yeah. No. Well, I think you partly answered your own question right there. It's just that, China's has to conduct a balancing act, right? They need to protect themselves, from a collapse, an economic collapse in the U.S. but at the same time, they don't want to see that collapse come about because they make a lot of money exporting things to the U.S. So
Hmm.
it's a yeah, so it's a balancing act there. I would say just a couple. Why hasn't it happened already? I think I'll just point to two things. It's just the incredible power of inertia and the status quo. It's just that there is just, old habits really die hard. Even when, new information comes out, it's just these, the notion that the dollar signifies safety is still, it's just there. And it's so deeply ingrained in so many investors that even though, yeah, they're aware of these things, they still act on the old habits. Um, and then, but then also, I think there's a lack of a clear alternative, which is what I understand. It's just that, the dollar is still has the advantages of being just of highly liquid and, with the exception now of places like Russia or whatever, it's just universally accepted. Um, so it still has its advantages, and I guess there's not a clear alternative. Now, maybe, like the BRICS countries are talking about coming up with some kind of alternative, maybe a basket of currencies or something. And perhaps if that happens, perhaps that will, it, um, that could be the beginning of the end. We'll see. I, I just put those two things out for you.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. So overall, what are all these crises that we're experiencing right now? The cultural crises, the economic crisis. Um, what was the other one we talked about?
Censorship.
The censorship, right? Exactly. I mean, is this all culminating? What does this culminate into? What does this mean for Americans in the United States? Like, are we looking into create a breakdown of our society? Are we looking into secession movements within the U.S.? Are we looking at sort of an iron dome, iron curtain being placed around the Anglosphere now instead, and
Right.
we're inside where we're contained? Like, well, what does the future look like to you?
Well, um, yeah, I guess what you see is an establishment that really is circling its wagons, and that's by attempting censorship, by censoring. Um, I mean, that's part of it. That's part of the way that they circle their wagons, and by punishing, any country that deviates from the established geopolitical line. Countries like Slovakia and Hungary, they're subjected to a lot of pressure, for not going along. You see that, or countries that are on the edge, like Georgia. That was supposed to be on a path to join the EU and NATO eventually, and they haven't. They've been naughty. They've passed laws that anger their betters in the EU, in the Western establishment, and so now they're being sanctioned. And so I think we're seeing this. It's sort of like a circling of the wagons and a drawing of the lines. That's, I think, we're seeing a real fracturing. The U.S., which it likes to in the West, it likes to describe itself as the international community, but it's much less than that. As we just said, it's pretty much Western Europe, the Anglosphere, and a few of its let's say vassal states in the East. Um, they are going to increasingly they are becoming isolated, and it used to be that they had sway over much of the world, because of their vast economic strength. They were able to shape the world discourse and impose um, sanctions very effectively on various regimes around the world. The sanctions that caused the starvation of the hundreds of thousands, for example, in Iraq. The sanctions that nearly brought Iran to its knees. But um, now that they've become isolated, yeah, they just don't have the strength. But you just don't. You could see, there's a different course. They say, well, okay, maybe this doesn't work. We need to accept a multipolar world and become, members of this multipolar world. And there's no reason they couldn't theoretically do this, and it would be very much to their benefit. But that's not what you're seeing. So, yeah, I guess I see sort of a circling of the wagons. It continue. We were seeing that already, and then it's going to continue. And we've identified, let's say, economic rot at the heart of the West. I think, again, the Ukraine war has revealed quite a bit. According to GDP measures, there's, Germany's supposed to be the fourth largest economy in the world, and the U.S. is the leading economy in the world, and they're supposed to just, vastly outproduce Russia or whatever. But it's just, we're seeing that it's just not true. There is an obvious weakness, hollowness at the heart of our economies. So yeah, I see a coming economic collapse. Again, there's ways we can climb out of it, but it just seems like as long as you're kind of refusing to look at things honestly, as long as our elite is just sort of is wedded to this hegemonic vision, we're not going to get out of it, because it just seems like no matter what, it's always somebody else's fault. And the only solution is just to double down with what we've been doing already, right? I haven't ever seen, is anybody talking about really changing course, reassessing? It's just that's what you hear from every last Western leader. It's just that we have to stay the course, whether it's, whether it's policies vis-a-vis Ukraine or Israel, I think, or so geopolitically, but also the economics. There's no sign that, for example, that Germany is reassessing at this point seriously its economic policies, that clearly have been disastrous. So yeah, I see a kind of a rather dark future for the West, and a West that cuts itself off from the rest of the world and begins to implode.
The way you describe it makes it seem like you're predicting kind of a prolonged darkness that will kind of slowly descend into it, and I don't see really a way out.
Yeah.
Earlier. I mean, once we descend into it, then chaos starts to happen, and who knows what comes out.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah, that's the thing, is it could be just slow, it could be gradual, and but there's no guarantee of that. There could be a sudden collapse. I'm just not going to predict that. Those things are just impossible to predict. But these various forces, economic and otherwise, can combine in surprising ways, and just could bring about some huge crisis. And it may not be very far in the future. We'll see.
And every time we have one of these conversations where I ask you about the future of the U.S., I end up going to Walmart the next day and buying a bunch of canned goods. So I just got so many canned goods in my basement now. Okay, well, let's try to pivot a little bit back over to our normal topics of the conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine. So we'll start with something that we were talking about just a little bit, and I've heard as well that there's this theory going around that maybe it's not so much that Israel is controlling the United States, but actually the United States uses Israel as a way to project dominance in the Middle East and just to kill Arabs, because that's basically our idea of, I don't know, creating a free world, defending Western civilization. To me, that theory seems to be ridiculous, but I know some smart people like Dr. Gilbert Doctorow to believe that, and I think maybe we should try to see it from their point of view and see if there's any credence, so I don't try to get too one-sided on my thoughts or opinions. Just because when I followed Netanyahu and Israel in the past year, since I've really been following it closely, I'm just like, to me, it's clear Israel's calling the shots, but maybe there's another way to look at it. So tell me what you think.
Well, this theory has been around for a long time. I think it's been probably around as long as Israel has been around. I remember, like, when I first became aware of the Palestinian injustice, was back in the early 1990s. One of the people, an advocate of Palestinians and a critic of Zionism, it was the famous linguist Noam Chomsky, who is still alive, very, very old, but still among the living. And yeah, he argued, or he believed, that Israel was basically a tool of the United States. It didn't make sense to me. I just didn't see the evidence for it. But what I think, like in his case, in the case of many other people who have advocated this, is that they're thinking theoretically rather than empirically. Because theoretically, if you just kind of came at this, you had no prior knowledge of the world, and you looked at a map and you saw, the U.S. and it was the largest military power in the world, and it's also the largest economy in the world. Though that's now a little bit doubtful. I think you can argue China is, but anyway, it's a very, very large economy. So very wealthy, very militarily very powerful, and you see this little country. Clearly, it must be that the U.S. is using this as kind of a bridgehead in the Middle East. That would be, just a rational assumption. And interesting, like John Mearsheimer, he's an advocate of realism. He has a theory of realism to explain the behavior of states, on the world stage, and how they relate to each other over security matters. And he says, quite frankly, he's quite honest about this. He acknowledges that, according to his theory, Noam Chomsky and Gilbert Doctorow should be right, theoretically. But, that's just not what's happening. And he doesn't have an explanation for it, but that's clearly not what's happening. Of course, he's done very careful studies of the relationship between Israel and the U.S. His book that, he published together with Stephen Walt back in the early 2000s. I remember when it came out, the Israel lobby points to just that. It's the power of the Israel lobby to shape American policy vis-a-vis the Middle East. So the thing is, you can understand why theoretically, you would want to make that assumption, but you have to look at the reality. And the thing is, let's just start thinking. You have to see how these two states actually relate, through various, institutions and incidents. And every time you look at it, you see Israel shaping U.S. policy. And I'm sorry, but I haven't seen anything to show the reverse. I mean, we can talk about, recently we had Thomas Massey talking about how every last member of Congress is assigned a babysitter, basically. This is, a representative from AIPAC or similar organization that lets people know, lets members of Congress know how they're supposed to vote. And they get calls, and, there are all kinds of, that's just one example, but examples of how this can work out. It can be very dramatic. Chas Freeman said that he was present at some sort of hearing, where there was, the topic of Israel came up, and there was a senator or a congressman from New York, and he began to say something that he wasn't supposed to say about Israel, and then his minder came in and whispered in his ear, and then he just dropped it. This is, it just happened, and there are countless stories like this. Or then, just think about the recent trip of that Netanyahu made, to the U.S. Congress. This is the U.S. Congress, just adoring him. He had to tell him to shut up and let him speak because they kept on applauding him. Now, if we have anything similar, I mean, can you talk about? I'm waiting for the story of the minders in the Knesset. Are there Americans who are telling the Knesset members how to vote? Does an American president go there and get 40? What was it? 58 standing ovations. And then let's look at the incident that I think in a way is really the watershed incident that really began it all, that set us on this very unhealthy course. And that is the USS Liberty, incident. It was Israel that, attacked the U.S. ship and killed 34 crew members. 34, 37. Yeah, I'm not sure, but it's one or the other. And then approximately 170 were injured. very nearly sank the ship. It was only because of very really brave, um, extraordinary courage on part of some of the crew members that the ship was saved. Every effort was made to sink it, and then okay, but then it was afterwards they were told not to say anything about it. Is this a country that is just simply a vassal of the U.S. That we just tell them what to do? Again, it's just the evidence is just when you look at specific incidents of any kind of um, where actual contact between the Israelis and the U.S. You always find it going the other way. I mean, now. So, I have some sympathy, at least for somebody initially who has that idea. We ourselves will say that this is crazy. How is this happened? This has never
Yeah.
happened in the history of the world because it is a crazy thing. So some people just say, well, it just can't be. But
Yeah,
they're
that's
not
how I
looking
am
at,
half the time.
yeah,
You
right.
tell me something like, "How is that possible? This is insane. How is it?"
Yeah.
But
But it's just true. It's just what happens in and out. And you can see it you don't have to dig very far to find the evidence of it. It's just, read the Israel Lobby, or there are a number of other, very good books, and the examples are countless.
mhm,
You have APAC just basically bragging that they own the U.S. Congress. They've bragged about it more than once on many occasions.
it's
Is
sick.
it, yeah, is there an American organization that brags about owning the Knesset? No.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me just ask you one more question. Just your thoughts on the Israeli retaliation that is supposed to be imminent. There was some report that I think some spokesperson for Israel was on CNN saying that the Middle East is going to see something they've never seen before. That it's going to be this huge attack, but at the same time, I'm hearing reports that oh, maybe Israel's getting a little scared, or we're able to rein them in. Just what's your assessment of this retaliation? What do you think
Yeah.
is happening? Do you think they're getting cold feet? Do you think that there's a problem because they can't carry out this strike without the United States, and the United States might be turning them away? I mean,
Yeah.
what are your
Well,
thoughts?
yeah, those things are possible. I would like to think that the U.S. put its foot down and said, yeah, no, we can't help you with this. Because we have seen evidence previous to this on more than one occasion that the Pentagon is not at all hot on an attack on Iran. And it seems that for Israel to carry out attack of any kind of scale, of on the scale that they're threatening to do, the U.S. would have to be involved because it would have to involve, it would require air refueling, major. I think Israel has some of that capability, but they don't have enough for a major attack. Maybe they have enough for a couple of planes or something, but this would have to be many planes. Um, You'd have to have bombers, and you'd have to have, escorting squadrons of fighters, and so the U.S. would have to be there. I'm sure the U.S. would need to provide um, satellite data, but yeah, they would have to also supply the refueling tankers, and yeah, clearly they don't want to do it. It's just that, like we said, the risk is okay. I think the Pentagon doesn't, but then the administration doesn't want to have the story leaked that okay, Israel was ready to defend themselves, as they would put it, and the U.S. said no. This is something that what kind of play that would get in the U.S. media, and Trump would be all over it, unfortunately, and it would probably hurt the Democrats. Maybe they're wrong because there are a lot of people that are, especially on the Democrat side of things, Democratic voters that are not happy about the way things are going on the Middle East. But it's again the donors. This is just Harris and the Democratic leadership. They're concerned about their base, but their focus is clearly on the donor class, and the donor class could turn on them in an instant if a story like that came out. So if there is something going on, I'm sure that's the U.S. finds itself that the Pentagon is probably fighting it, but then they, is reluctant to do it, but they may be forced to help them. But it may be that even with U.S. help, this is not going to be easy, and that's perhaps both the IDF and the Pentagon may have been trying to tell the politicians this in the past, but like we say, the politicians just tend to brush these things aside and assume that anything can be done, that Western power is unlimited. But it's again, Iran is a large country. It's done a lot to prepare for an attack like this. In fact, they were earlier concerned not so much as about an attack from Israel directly, but by the U.S. And, they knew the U.S. capabilities back during the George W. Bush years, after the attack on Iraq. So a lot of facilities are underground. A lot of facilities are very well defended. And it's, again, a large country. And the air defense is uncertain. We've heard the reports that the Russians have provided them with S-400s, as they have. That's a very, very, that's the world's most advanced air defense system. And it could very easily, I imagine, shoot down F-35s and F-16s. And they may be looking at that. Yeah, it just may be that they realized that, it was easy for Netanyahu and company to boast and threaten, dire consequences, but it's just much more difficult to do that in practice. This is not Lebanon. This is not the Gaza Strip. It's easy to be tough when you have, you're bombing a defenseless people, but these are not a defenseless people.
Interesting. Do you think that there's anything that can maybe be done internally, that Mossad has potentially infiltrated heavily within Iran, within the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard
What do you mean,
Corps?
Assad?
Sorry, not Assad. Sorry, I said Mossad.
Mossad. Okay,
Mossad.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm saying maybe.
Yeah.
Well,
maybe
there's always a risk of that, but we don't know that. That's probably not the case. There was some rumors of that. There's some fear. The fear is obvious. After what happened in Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not impossible, but I think it would be much more difficult to Lebanon, as Professor Mohammed Marandi pointed out, was always the weak link. It's a place where it's a very heterogeneous society with a very extensive Western presence. So if there was any place where the axis of resistance might be infiltrated, it would be Lebanon. Just much less likely that they would be able to pull that off in Iran.
Okay, so you think that there's a real possibility then that Israel wants to do this, but they may find that they're not able to. They put their word on the line that there's going to be something huge, that this is something that the Middle East has never seen. Netanyahu is saying that the long arm of Israel can touch anybody in the Middle East. Let's see, right? I mean, I guess that's all we can say. We just have to wait and see.
We'll have to wait and see exactly.
Okay, well, if the retaliation doesn't happen by next Friday, we can talk a little bit about Ukraine. We haven't touched that in a long time. I know there have been developments.
Yeah, certainly have been.
So we can dive into that next week, as long as the Middle East doesn't blow up.
Okay.
So let's hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah, well.
Anything's possible. It sounds silly for me to even say that, but that's where we are.
Yeah, well, it probably there's at least a 50-50 chance that it will, so we'll see.
Okay. All right, Dad. Thanks a lot. Have a good rest of your day.
All right, you too.